So in terms of going over the Hobbes quiz, the first question that we have regards to overthrowing the Hobbesian sovereign. And the answer we were looking for, that it's only legitimate if the coup is successful. So if you are able to overthrow the sovereign, then you now have the power to pass the laws which in turn dictate morality, so that you're able to say that your coup was moral. If, on the other hand, you're not able to have that power, then your coup is not going to be moral. So a coup for Hobbes is moral if and only if it is successful. In terms of equality, Hobbes is going to argue that people are equal, but they're equal because they are equally scared of each other. For even the strongest and the best amongst us is not so wonderful that they could not be overpowered by a group of weaker others. Okay? So Hobbes's argument for our equality is not based on some lofty understanding, okay? It's not that we're all equal because we're all created equal by God in his image. But he does argue that we are equal because we are equally scared. For Hobbes, we join government for a few reasons, and here I was looking for all of the above, okay? The first is that we can be persuaded that cooperation is good, but we recognize that without the sovereign, cooperation is not possible. And that goes back to the idea of the two people who were picking the corn, right? Because each is trying to get the best deal, either free corn or free pick of corn without paying wages, what ends up happening is that the corn rots. So we can recognize that we need cooperation, but it's not possible to cooperate unless we have a sovereign. Now, in certain cases, Hobbes argues that you might be forced into cooperating or joining the state of civility by the sovereign's power being applied directly to you. Okay, so let's say that you decide that you just don't want to obey any of these laws. Well, the sovereign can still kind of come and force you to by the sword. And then part C was basically a little bit more in-depth restatement of part A. We are inclined to try to cheat each other at every turn, right? Because we're psychological egoists, so we're trying to get our own best interest. Because it's in our selfish nature to do so. But we also realize that if we continue down that path, cooperation is not possible, and that cooperation is also in our rational self-interest. And therefore, we go ahead and consent to having the sovereign. According to Hobbes, the state of nature is going to be like a state of war because the inherent selfishness of people would cause them to fight each other for goods. So you have something that I believe that I need in order to survive. In the state of nature, I'm going to kill you for it. No, let's look at the wrong answers for a second. A happy place where we would all frolic in the forest, happy to be away from the evil sovereign. That sounds a lot more like Jean-Jacques Rousseau than it does Hobbes. And if you're interested in that, you can come and take social and political in the fall, and we will talk more about the differences between the various social contract theorists. In this class, you're just getting the taste of one. True or false? Morality can only exist in the state of civility, under government, after the sovereign has used power to establish laws, which in turn dictate morality. True. So in the state of nature, there is no morality on Hobbes's view. There is only the right of nature and the law of nature, which allows you to use violence. Hobbes agrees with the divine command theorist, or the divine right of kings, that the sovereign is a better person than the rest of us, handpicked by God to lead the people. False, right? That's why the monarchists get so angry with Hobbes. He argues that the sovereign is just as evil and selfish and whatever else, ruthless, as the rest of us, maybe a little bit more so in order to be able to keep power. Hobbes argues that the governed consent to the state of civility. What kind of consent best describes Hobbes's argument? The answer I was looking for here is hypothetical consent. Okay? You weren't asked, but the point is that the way that Hobbes describes the state of nature is so awful that any of us, had we been asked, would prefer the state of civility, okay? So if someone were to ask the subject whether she consents to government, she would, because she would be persuaded the state of nature is so much worse than the state of civility. Let's look at the wrong answers. Active consent. The subject has signed a piece of paper consenting to the sovereign's rule. Did that happen? Did you sign anything? No, I didn't either. Tacit consent. The sovereign consents to the subject consents to the sovereign's rule by not leaving the state. Some people have argued that that's what Hobbes is up to, but I don't think that's accurate. I think that makes more sense for John Locke than it does for Hobbes. As an aside, if I don't want to be under any sovereign, is there any place I can go? No, I mean, there are still laws there.
The ocean.
I mean, international water is still going to be under maritime law.
Mars.
How am I getting to Mars? Right? Antarctica, I think, is under international law.
So you could kill yourself.
But that wouldn't be a place. Or possibly, right? That's a different conversation, I guess. Which of the following best describes the view of human nature according to Hobbes? Human beings are psychological egoists, solely concerned with their own selfish interests. So this leads human life to be dirty, nasty, brutish, and short. So he doesn't think that we're altruistic. This notion that human beings do not have a specific nature but make their natures through the choices they make every day, that's Sartre, not Hobbes. We'll get to him later. The laws set forth by the sovereign on this view are obeyed because the individual recognizes the sovereign's monopoly on force and violence is the only way to have a kind of cooperation. So let's look at the wrong answers. Are obeyed because they're in the best interest of the community. No, they're not in the best interest of the community. They're in the best interest of the sovereign. But it's in the best interest of the community for there to be laws that are enforced. They're not in the absolute best interest of the individual, unless that individual happens to be the sovereign. And they do change from one sovereign to the next, right? Hobbes' view of morality is relative. Depending on who is in power, they're going to pass laws, which can then dictate morality. Presumably, different people are going to pass different sets of laws when they're in power. Okay. So in terms of the exam review, let's start with the questions that are in introduction. Now, please note that the request that was made for this assignment was for you to ask me things to review, not for the format of the exam or whether something is going to be on the exam, but just for you to have a chance to ask me some questions and for me to answer them, okay? So if there are any questions over exam format, I'm not going to answer them. I'm only going to answer questions that are over content. So let's review. There are 4 branches of... Here, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the computer. There are 4 branches of philosophy, and I do want you to know them. We have metaphysics, or ontology, epistemology, logic, and ethics. Metaphysics is concerned with questions of reality. Epistemology is concerned with questions of how we know, or knowledge. Now, obviously, in order for me to have knowledge of something, it has to exist. Even though there may be things that exist that I can't perceive. So these 2 branches of philosophy interrelate quite a bit. Okay? So if I ask you, am I living in the matrix? Which of these two branches would that be? Metaphysics, because we're talking about questions of reality. If I ask, how do I know whether I'm living in the matrix? Now we're talking about epistemology because we're talking about knowledge. Logic is concerned with arguments and their logical structure. And ethics is concerned with questions of morality and moral action. Okay? Now, there are also 4 branches of ethics. And the best way to think of them is to start by talking about normative or theoretical ethics. So this is the branch of ethics that is concerned with how we should make ethical decisions and giving us a theory for how we should make ethical decisions. So, for example, the doctrine of double effect is an example of normative or theoretical ethics, right? Aquinas is saying this is how you should make your decisions. Logically, prior to that is the branch called meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is called that because it comes before doing ethical theorizing. Meta-ethical questions tend to be more epistemological or ontological in nature. So, meta-ethics might ask the question, do we have free will? That question comes before questions of theoretical ethics because it doesn't make any sense to talk about whether I should make a certain decision in a certain way if it turns out that I don't make any of my own decisions. Applied ethics is going to take theoretical ethics and is going to apply it to a specific scenario. So if you're concerned with, for example, whether it was legitimate for J-Lo's character, Slim, enough to kill her husband, one way that we might go about that is to take the doctrine of double effect and to apply it to that situation. And finally, we have descriptive ethics, which is concerned with how actual people make actual ethical decisions, right? Describing those ethical decisions. The word philosophy means love of wisdom etymologically, right? So we were asked, what do philo and sophos mean? Philo means love, sophos means wisdom. What order did we learn the philosophers in? We've been studying them in order, so we learned them in historical order, right? We talked about Thales, the first philosopher. You can't step in the same river twice. We talked about Socrates and his student Plato and his student Aristotle. Then we skipped a whole bunch of time, but we mentioned Augustine and then Aquinas. From Aquinas, we went to Hobbes. Any questions over the stuff we did before Plato, before I move on? Okay. So let's talk about Plato. In terms of understanding Plato, one of the most important aspects of understanding him are the theories of the forms, right? So Plato posits the existence of these things called the forms, which are perfect, non-physical, unchanging, unyielding, that we discover through pure reason. And the forms exist outside of us, right, in some mystical realm. But there's a form of justice for Plato. There's a form of the good. There is a form of laws. Now, when we use pure reason to access the forms, they get copied into our minds, and that's what gives us theories. So the difference is that forms are perfect, theories are not. Forms exist outside of us, theories exist in our heads. Theories get copied again to make objects, and they get copied again to make images. We conceptualize in order to understand theories. We have beliefs about objects, and we understand images at the level of custom. So the idea here is that forms are the most real, images are the least real. Pure reason is the most accurate way of understanding something. Custom is the least accurate way of understanding something. Okay? So Plato is giving us a hierarchy here, where at the top we have the most real or the most certain, and at the bottom we have the least real and the least certain. Okay, so let's think about this for a moment. Was there ever a form of cell phone? Well, if it turns out that there is a form of cell phone, then it existed prior to Plato being born, right? Because forms don't come in and out of existence. They've always existed. What probably makes more sense is that there's a form of perfect communication. And then in understanding that form, we make theories about communication. Wouldn't it be nice if we could communicate with each other no matter where the other person is and no matter where I am? And then those theories get copied into objects, and then we use that cell phone in order to make us a selfie of ourselves on the phone. I guess you'd have to have two phones in order to do that, but work with me. So that's all derivative. In terms of the arguments in the Credo, yes, I expect you to know the major arguments that were made in the Credo. Now, I'm not as concerned with you knowing the arguments that were made with regards to why Socrates chose not to leave on a personal level, right? So the reputation argument, for example, I'm not as concerned with. But I do expect you to know two wrongs don't make a right, the argument against chaos, the argument of reciprocal obligations, and the argument of the spirit of the laws. Especially because the spirit of the laws relates back to this idea of the forms, right? The form of law requires certain things, or the form of justice. Which part of it?
The four of them, I have two wrongs, so make a right. Chaos, what we have to.
Reciprocal obligations and spirit of the law. So in terms of how we come to know the simile of the line, Plato gives us this story of the allegory of the cave, right? Now, whether I test you on this or not, it's important for you to understand this story because you've taken a philosophy course, and it's just an important moment in the history of Western civilization. Well, not a historical moment, right? But it's an important concept in the history of Western civilization. So the story goes that there is a person, right? There are many people who are tied to a chair. And they're staring in the front, and all they see are these shadows that are being flickered on the wall. But they don't know any better because they're tied up. Then this man hears a voice. Maybe it's the voice of reason, maybe it's the voice of madness, we don't know. But his chains fall when he hears that voice. And he turns around. And when he does, he realizes that there's a fire and there are people walking in front of the fire holding on to objects. And as they're walking by, those objects are casting shadows. Okay? So the idea here is that images are the shadows of objects. Then the man starts to climb out of the cave. And that ascent is supposed to be a metaphor for education. Once he's outside, he initially can't really see anything, right? His eyes are too used to being in the dark. But eventually he's able to look at the grass and the trees, which is a metaphor for theories. And then eventually he's able to look onto the sun, which is a metaphor for the forms. Then he tries to go back into the cave and get everybody else to understand what's going on, but they don't want to hear it, and so they beat him up instead. Okay? Which seems to be somewhat related to what happened to Socrates in his trial. Plato's view of human nature is that human beings are rational and that justice requires that there be a certain harmony. So remember that for Plato, there are three parts to the individual human soul. We have spirit, we have appetite, and we have reason. Now, appetite will never check itself. The more you feed your appetites, the stronger they become. So that was the conversation regarding shoes in Kim Kardashian, right? We're never going to turn on E! News to find out that Kim Kardashian has bought her last pair of shoes because these shoes are so awesome that she doesn't need any other pair of shoes. The more you feed your appetite for shoes, the more shoes you want. Spirit may or may not be able to check itself. Some people are meeker. They have less spirit, so maybe their spirit does check itself. Some people are really spirited and their spirit doesn't check itself. But the point for Plato is that reason needs to be in charge of both spirit and appetite in order for there to be justice. So justice for Plato is a certain kind of harmony between reason, appetite, and spirit. So it does make sense that Colin Kaepernick decided to sell off all his shoes, because it's not that he found the perfect pair of sneakers and decided that he no longer needed any more shoes. It's that he suddenly came to realize that his desire for shoes is not the sort of thing he should be desiring for, that he should be desiring for justice instead, and that he could fulfill that desire by selling off all his shoes and using the money to do some good in the world. But that's a situation where spirit came in. It's not like his appetite suddenly changed. I'm sure that if he walks in the mall and he sees a really pretty pair of shoes, he's still going to want them. Or handsome pair of shoes. Right? But his reason is going to tell him, hey, this money would be better spent trying to get clean water for kids in Flint, Michigan. Now, in terms of Plato versus Socrates, we don't know anything really about, we know a few things about the historical Socrates, but not very many. We know for sure that Plato wrote all the stuff that we've been talking about this semester. So all of the questions on the midterm will be in the context of Plato. And if there is any reference to Socrates, then it will be clear that I'm talking about the character of Socrates versus the historical Socrates. Okay, but I haven't finished writing the test yet, but for the most part, I usually talk about it in terms of Plato. So, Madison, it looks like you wanted me to actually go through the three major arguments. So the argument against chaos basically says that people obey the law because they are afraid of punishment, and that without laws, there would be chaos. So if people are capable of breaking the law all the time, or if they break the law without accepting their punishment, then the world will go into chaos, and chaos is bad, therefore you should obey the law. By the way, in terms of the logical structure of this is an argument style called reductio ad absurdum, right? You get to the absurdity of chaos, and then you say, okay, in that case, we must obey the law. Any other questions on Plato before we move on to Aristotle? let's talk about Aristotle's notion of virtue. Now, in order for a person to be virtuous on Aristotle's views, they need several things. First, they need material conditions, right? You need to be smart enough to be able to do philosophy. You need to be tall enough to be able to easily reach the projector screen. You need to be good looking enough that people want to be friends with you, right? You need to be free from the need to perform manual labor so you have enough time to study philosophy and reflect on your habits, right? You need the right birth. Some political connections would be good, the right children, etc. The major focus for Aristotle in terms of virtue is a focus on habits, making sure that you have the right habits. And the idea for Aristotle is that you can't know what a specific situation is going to require you to do. There's no one rule, he thinks, that will tell you how to behave in every situation, because every situation is so different. But if you have the right habits, then no matter what situation you find yourself in, then those habits will automatically carry you through that particular situation. So for Aristotle, a lot of virtue is learning the right habits, establishing the right habits, thinking about whether your habits are good or bad, trying to tweak your habits, etc. He also talks a lot about moderation. So for Aristotle, courage is part of virtue. But in order to have courage, that means being afraid of the right things for the right reasons in the right proportion. If you're too scared, you're a coward. If you're not scared enough, you're foolhardy. To be courageous, on Aristotle's view, is to have the right amount of fear. So a lot of what Aristotle has to say regarding virtue is related to this notion of moderation. But when I think of what Aristotle meant by virtue friendship, I imagine two people who walk around a lot and talk about philosophy and talk about their habits and try to figure out what better habits would look like. Engage in some sort of scientific inquiry, right? But that their friendship is ultimately based on each person helping the other to become a better person. What are Aristotle's views on the forms? How do they differ from Plato's? Okay, look, before I erase this, the ancients were very concerned with this question of change. How do we explain change? How is it the case that something is the same and now it's different? Is everything constantly changing all the time? Is there no such thing as change? How do we make sense of this? So Plato says, look, the forms are perfect. They don't change. But when they get copied into theories, or they get copied into objects, or they get copied into images, every time a copy happens, that's where change comes from. Change is a deterioration from perfection. Salute. And Aristotle comes back and says, I don't think so. Sometimes change is for the better, right? Sometimes change is evolution. So, and he doesn't like this notion of the forms that exist, I don't know, somewhere out in the sky in this mystical realm. So instead, Aristotle posits that every substance is made up of essence and matter, where essence or form remains the same. That's the actuality of the substance, while the matter or potentiality changes. Okay? So the form for Aristotle exists within the substance itself. And once the substance is removed, then the essence no longer exists. So let's take the substance of a knife. What is its essence? It's a functional excellence. What is the purpose of a knife? To cut, right? So we say that a knife is more excellent if it is sharp and it's less excellent if it's dull. Okay. Now if I take a white phosphorus grenade and I throw it at that knife, what's going to happen? It disintegrates completely. So is there any essence of knife as a functional excellence to cut that remains for Aristotle? No. What about for Plato? Yeah, there's still a form of knife, right, that was copied into a theory that was used in order to make this substance. I was driving around the other day and I saw a billboard that said, it was a picture of a shampoo bottle. And the shampoo bottle was thinking about becoming a hairbrush. And the billboard was saying something like, please recycle me so that I can become a hairbrush. And I really started thinking about this in terms of Aristotle. Because could it be possible that the substance that is currently a water bottle secretly yearns, right? Its essence is actually of hairbrush. And it yearns to become a hairbrush. And it needs you to recycle it so that it can get closer to the prime mover, right, that is pulling it to itself like a magnet. Remember that the prime mover is the only substance that is pure actuality with no potentiality. So that it wants to go closer to the prime mover by becoming a hairbrush. And I think this kind of leads us into the question of the four causes for Aristotle. So we have the material cause, which is the physical stuff that needs to change in order for it to come about, right? So that would be the plastic that the shampoo bottle is made out of. Then we have the formal cause, or essence, of the substance. So this would be the hairbrushness that is in the shampoo bottle that is trapped and hoping to be transformed into a hairbrush so that it can brush my hair before I talk about philosophy. Then we have the efficient cause, which is the actual change that is required to bring this all about. The force that is required to bring this change about. So I'm not precisely sure how recycling works, but I imagine that there's some process by which the plastic is melted and reformed into something else. And then the final cause is what is the ultimate purpose, right? To beautify my hair before I give this lecture. Whatever. What is Aristotle's explanation of the prime mover? The prime mover is a being that moves but is not itself moved. It's the final cause of the universe in the sense that it is moving us towards it.
Say that again?
It is the final cause of the universe in the sense that it is moving us towards it. What are the three types of friendships according to Aristotle? Pleasure. These are people that you're friends with either because you share a pleasurable activity, you play tennis together, or because they are naturally pleasant. Good looking, funny, they smell good, whatever. You have utility friends. These are people that you are friends with because they provide you something that is useful. So the person who gives you notes for this class would be a utility friend. And then finally you have character or perfect or virtue or a arete friend, however you want to refer to it. The difference here is that your arete friend is a person whose friendship cannot be replaced because you were friends with them because of who they are and their virtue. Whereas utility and pleasure friends are temporary. That which they provide you will end. Anything else on Aristotle before we move on? Aristotle's view of human nature, he thinks human beings are rational, right? Does he think that we're loners? No, he thinks that we're political creatures, right? We want to be with each other. He thinks we're self-interested, but he draws a distinction between being self-interested and being self-absorbed. So Aristotle argues that it's in my best interest to make sure that my neighbor is well fed. Because if I'm rich and my neighbor is starving, what's my neighbor going to do? Steal from me, and that's not in my best interest. So I feed my neighbor not out of some altruistic perspective, but to preserve my house from getting broken into. Okay? Aristotle draws a pretty sharp distinction between being happy and being content. Happiness for him, eudaimonia, definitely a concept to review, is a certain kind of philosophical undertaking. So if you get up in the morning, use the money that you made last night to buy groceries so that you can eat breakfast, then you go to work, come home, crack open a six-pack, eat a pizza, watch the game, and go to sleep so that you can do it all over again, Aristotle's going to say you're not happy. That's content. It's the best you can do. In order to be happy, you have to be engaged in a certain kind of philosophical undertaking, on his view. And that's part of what it means to be virtuous, right? That's the whole point of why you would bother to go through all the trouble to become virtuous on Aristotle's view, is in order to achieve eudaimonia.
How do you spell that?
E-U-I-D-O-M-O-N-I-A. It's definitely in your reading. Okay, let's move on to Aquinas. So Aquinas is an Aristotelian, right? So he's going to agree with Aristotle on his methods of empiricism. He's going to take this idea of the prime mover, though, and he's going to baptize Aristotle and turn it into a Christian understanding of God. So whereas before the prime mover was only the omega, the final cause of the world, now the prime mover will become also the creator of the world under Aquinas. So in Aquinas' view, we have eternal law, which we can either understand from a Platonic perspective as the sum total of all Platonic forms, from a theistic perspective, we could understand it as God's own understanding of the universe. And from an atheistic perspective, we could understand it as the internal rules of the universe. Natural law is our ability to understand and live out eternal law. And there are two aspects of natural law in terms of Aquinas that I expect you to be really familiar with. One is the doctrine of double effect, and the other are the restrictions that natural law places on human law in order for human law to be just. So on Aquinas' view, laws must be reasonable, meaning that it must be possible to follow them, logical consistency, etc. They must be written in the best interest of the people. Obviously a major difference between him and Hobbes. They must be written by those who have the best interest of the people in mind. And finally, they must be promulgated. They can't be secret. It has to be possible to know them. In terms of divine command theory, Aquinas isn't necessarily against the idea that you should do something because God commands it. I mean, he is, after all, a Christian saint. But he recognizes that it may be difficult to be able to establish exactly what it is that God commands or requires in a specific situation. So part of the way that Aristotle is baptized by Aquinas is that Aquinas says, go out into the world, observe the world, and reflect on that observation. But part of the reflection is that because the world was created by God, by understanding the creation, we can understand something about its creator. In terms of the doctrine of double effect, remember, your primary motivation has to be a morally justified one, ideally to preserve life. Whatever it is that happens has to be an unintended or unfortunate double effect. And you have to use the least amount of force in order to bring this about. So the idea is that if Jacob is coming at me with a machete, my primary motivation is to preserve my life or to preserve Elida's. If the only way to do that is to kill him, since my primary motivation is to preserve life and his death is an unfortunate consequence, then that is permissible on Aquinas' view. Now, if it's possible for me to disarm him and not kill him, but I choose to kill him, then that would be problematic under the doctrine of double effect because I have to use the least amount of violence necessary in order to preserve the life. In terms of this class, I am treating eternal law and divine law as though they were one thing. If you go on to take a full-blown class in medieval philosophy, you will get a better treatment of it than that, but for our purposes, I am using them interchangeably. Now, the doctrine of double effect is sometimes dealt with in order to talk about physician-assisted suicide. And this gets a little complicated. So let's say that you have a patient who has cancer and is also in a tremendous amount of pain, but the patient's liver is too weak. And so the patient asks for pain medication and is told, if we administer pain medication to you, there is a good possibility that you will die because your liver is too weak to metabolize it. Now, if the patient says, doesn't matter, I can't take this pain, give the pain medication to me, what is the doctor's primary motivation in that situation? To alleviate the pain of the patient. What is the unintended consequence? The patient may die. Now, the reason why we call that unintended is that if the patient survives the night, the doctors are going to be happy with it, right? They don't want the patient to die. What they want is for the pain to end. Now, some people interpret the doctrine of double effect as to only require that you have to have your primary motivation be one that is morally permissible. So the preservation of the quality of life, ending of pain, etc. I think that's too broad, because when we think about this whole method of go out into the world, observe the world, notice that life strives to remain alive, I think a more accurate interpretation of the doctrine of double effect is that the primary motivation must be to save life, and not quality of life, but actually the life itself. But other scholars of the doctrine of double effect disagree. So if you're going to do physician-assisted suicide and Aquinas, then obviously that's going to be a very complicated part of your paper. Because if you say that the primary motivation has to be to preserve life, then physician-assisted suicide would never be permissible. If you say that your primary motivation can be to end suffering, then physician-assisted suicide could be morally permissible. Okay, and then there's a question here that says, what ideas did St. Augustine and Aquinas disagree on causing the birth of Christianity? Not quite. So Christianity happens before both Augustine and Aquinas. But what Augustine does is to reconcile Christianity with Platonic doctrine, and then Aquinas comes along and reconciles Christianity with Aristotelian doctrine, which means that along the way he also reconciles Plato and Aristotle, right? Hence the term great reconciliator. Oh, good question. What is the good of society in Aquinas' view, right? So when you're talking about the 4 requirements of law, right? Of human law, that human law is supposed to hold up in order to be just under natural law. One of them is that it has to be for the good of society. And a lot of people have wondered, what precisely does Aquinas mean by the good of society? One of the answers that I like best is Dr. Martin Luther King's answer in the letter from Birmingham jail. He defines the good of society as human flourishing. And I really like that because, first of all, Aristotle, Aquinas, they're empiricists, so this idea of focusing on natural language like flourishing. But I like this idea of thinking of each individual person as a seed, and that what is good for society is whatever allows for all of those seeds to flourish. So following up on this, we have, how do you measure what's good for the society as a whole? What may be good for one part of it may not be good for another. And Aquinas is going to say, look, whatever laws you pass have to be in the best interest of everybody. So getting back to King, when in the letter from Birmingham jail, he says that Jim Crow goes against human flourishing, he says that the reason why Jim Crow goes against human flourishing is that it gives the segregated a false sense of inferiority and the segregator a false sense of superiority. So he makes the argument in terms of it being against everybody's interest. But Aquinas is going to have a huge problem with a law that's passed that benefits one group of people above others, right? That's like saying, I'm going to go and water the seeds, but I'm only going to water this plot and I'm not going to water the rest of them, right? What's good for society should be consistent with everybody flourishing. If you're trying to preserve life no matter what, do you put another's life over yours according to Aquinas? No. But do notice that the doctrine of double effect works whether I am preserving my own life or the life of another's. And that I'm required to use the least amount of force. That's different than Hobbes' notion of the right of nature. For Hobbes, I can use as much force as I want, but I can only preserve my own life, not the life of another's. And Jessica, did you still have questions over divine command theory?
Mm-hmm.
You got it? Okay. Oh, this is weird. You show up as Jessica instead of Jess on here. Like, who's Jessica? Oh, right. Okay. Okay, let's go on to just war theory. What is the difference between just cause and right intention and jus ad bellum? Very important question. Just cause is your stated reason for going to war, and it has to be a morally permissible one. So following the doctrine of double effect, self-defense from external attack and defense of an allied nation are considered uncontroversial. If you think about it, humanitarian intervention, why are you going in? Well, because you're trying to save lives, right? Life strives to remain alive. We should save lives. So that makes sense in terms of the doctrine of double effect too. Preemptive strike, which is the most iffy of the reasons of just cause, is still talking about it in terms of if the attack is allowed to happen, it will cause such a blow that we will not be able to defend ourselves from it. Therefore, we should be able to strike before that attack actually occurs. So just cause is your stated reason for going to war, and it has to be a morally justified one. Now, right intention asks, is that your real reason Or is that just your excuse? So take the example of Libya. The cause that was given for going into Libya was humanitarian intervention against Gaddafi. Okay, was Gaddafi a dictator who was mistreating his people? Seems to be that way. But Gaddafi has been a dictator who has been mistreating his people longer than I've been alive, or he was before he was deposed. So why did the United States decide in that particular moment that Gaddafi needed to be overthrown? If it had something to do with how he was selling oil or to whom he was selling it, then right intention might say, was humanitarian intervention really your reason for going to war? Or were you going to war for oil and you were just using humanitarian intervention as your excuse? So right intention says that whatever your just cause is, it has to be your real reason, not your excuse for going to war. Patience, you asked what is the difference between each of the theories? I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that question.
That's what I meant, different juice and all that.
Okay, so we have three juice. We have three juices in this class, right? We have jus ad bellum, which is the justness of going to war. Jus in bello, and you can remember that that one is the justness of how we behave while we're in war, right? In and in. And then jus post bellum, which is concerned with how we behave after we end the war. So jus ad bellum is interested in how did we decide to go to war, and is that philosophically and morally justified? In bello is concerned with how we behave while we're in war. So ad bellum is normally seen as being the province of generals and the president and leaders, because they're the ones that make the decision to go to war, while in bello is seen as constraining soldiers because they're the ones that are fighting it. Now post bellum wants to make sure that this war, once it ends, that there is an everlasting peace, right? That it's not just a ceasefire. And so post bellum is going to make sure that things are put in place so that this war doesn't start over at some later time. The realist critique of just war theory, we could call the Hobbesian critique, right? Or the Hobbesian realist critique, basically says no. You shouldn't go to war for morally justified reasons. You shouldn't tie one hand behind your back and fight that war fairly. That's just going to mean you're going to lose. The realist is going to say that you should fight war why ever you want, by whatever means you want, in order to be the most effective. Now, what power does just war theory have if one nation doesn't follow these rules? Well, one of the requirements of jus in bello is no reprisals, which basically says that if the enemy you're fighting breaks these rules, you're not allowed to break them. And that's when the realist says, okay, but if my enemy is throwing white phosphorus grenades at my soldiers, and I'm not allowed to throw white phosphorus grenades at their soldiers, then they're going to win because they're using a more powerful weapon, and I'm fighting with one arm tied behind my back because I'm not allowing myself to.
But you're allowed to do residual force.
No, you're allowed to have a proportional attack, right? There's a proportionality requirement that says that your attack has to be proportional to their attack.
Right. So
But you still can't use banned weapons. So if you throw a white phosphorus grenade at me, doesn't matter. I'm still not allowed to throw white phosphorus grenades back at you. So jus ad bellum means the 6 requirements of the justness of going to war, right? So just cause, we've talked about, the reason for going to war. Right intention says that that's the real reason, not your excuse. The 3rd requirement is proper authority and public declaration. So somebody has to say, by the way, we're going to war, and they have to have the authority to make that declaration. Last resort says that you've tried everything else, and war is the last option. So that's kind of like the using the least amount of force requirement from Aquinas. Then we have proportionality, which says that the attack or the reason that you suffered, that you're going into war, has to be proportional to the evil of war itself. So think about it this way. If Marites slaps me, is it legitimate for me to take out my handgun and pour an entire clip into her?
No.
What do you think?
No. Let's not be that.
I wouldn't do that anyway. But the idea is that it's not a proportional response. So similarly, if you're now a nation and 3 of your citizens are hiking and they accidentally cross into my border, now is that an act of war? I mean, technically speaking, yeah, right? I mean, we have a border and her people are, not respecting it. Would it be proportional for me to go to war with her over it? No. And then the 6th requirement is probability of success. And it basically, look, it's not just saying, can we win the war? It's saying, if we win the war, will it fix the problem that is the reason we went to war in the first place? And that gets interesting when we talk about the war on terror, because a lot of people have argued that the warfare that we're engaging in other countries is just making more people want to join up in the resistance against the United States. If that's the case, then that would be an issue in terms of the probability of success, because it's not just about winning the war, it's about achieving the outcome that you went to war for in the first place. And not creating a bigger mess. So that's why there are certain cases in which you might say, for example, humanitarian intervention. Like you might say, okay, it really is the case that people are dying here and that something needs to be done. But if we end up killing more people as we're trying to save them, and it's not possible for a new government to be put in place by means of force that would have these people be better off, then what's the point of going to war in that situation? We're going to have to come up with another solution. So remember, for the just war theory essay on the midterm exam, I am asking you to pick a specific conflict, World War II or more recent, that the United States has been involved in, and for you to explain these 6 requirements and apply them in order to establish whether the war is just. What are the consequences for not following just war theory? Well, a lot of this has been enshrined in international law. So technically speaking, the entire world could go to war against you for having broken these rules. And, whatever consequences you think might happen to somebody who acts immorally as individuals, if you think that such things occur. So in terms of jus post bellum, it is in your reading, so you might want to make sure to look at those requirements. But the most important thing that I want you to know about jus post bellum is that these requirements are to make sure that there's not another war. So, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, the justification given for going to Afghanistan is that Afghanistan is a rogue state which harbors terrorists because it doesn't have full integrity over its nation. So jus post bellum can require in that situation, look, you got to have a working government so that we make sure that this doesn't happen again. Or Japan, right? Japan was seen as being engaged in a war of aggression during World War II. So one of their post-bellum requirements is they're no longer allowed to have a standing army. So the whole point of jus post-bellum is just to make sure that this war ends and stays ended. versus just starting back up a few months or a few years later.
Didn't that recently change though?
I'm sorry, Aiden, could you ask that again?
So didn't that recently change though? Or both Germany and Japan both increasing the size of the group?
I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure if Japan is now allowed to slightly increase their troops, but I mean, that's part of the reason why you have so many U.S. military bases in Japan, right? Since they're not allowed to engage in a certain kind of military exercise, then the United States has basically said, okay, we'll defend you in case something happens to you, because we basically said that you're no longer allowed to defend yourselves. So I don't know if there's been a push to allow them to increase their troops slightly so that the U.S. can decrease their troops slightly, but I hadn't heard about that. Okay, any other questions about just war theory, or may I move on to consent? What is the difference between active consent and enthusiastic consent? Active consent requires you to do something to show that you voluntarily consented. So that could be nodding, it could be saying yes, it could be signing a contract, right? You have to engage in an action in order to show that you've consented. But we consent to things that we don't really want to do. So enthusiastic consent says that you consented to it and you're really excited about it. You really do want to do it, right? Yay! So, let's say that Johnny Depp asks you out to a movie, but it's a movie you don't want to see, right? So you say yes because it's Johnny Depp. But are you enthusiastic about going to see this particular movie? Not really, right? So we wouldn't call that enthusiastic consent. So anytime that you've signed a contract that you didn't really agree with, but you signed it because you needed to move into the apartment and so you've got to sign this thing, right? Or you sign the syllabus consent form even though you don't like my late policy because this is the only time slot that you can take the class in, so you're kind of stuck taking it anyway. Okay? That gets to the idea of the difference between active and enthusiastic. What about the difference between tacit and hypothetical? We talked about that a little bit in relation to Hobbes. So tacit consent basically says you did not dissent, therefore you consented. So in order for tacit consent to be the case, you have to be capable of dissenting. So getting back to the syllabus example, let's say that you didn't sign the syllabus requirement form, right? I agree to the syllabus requirements. You didn't sign it. And then at the end of the semester, I say to you, I failed you because you didn't adhere to the policies, and you say, ha ha ha, I never signed it. ACC is going to say, well, you tacitly consented because you chose to remain in the course knowing the syllabus policies were in place. You could have withdrawn, but you did not. Therefore, you consented because you didn't dissent. You didn't say no, you didn't leave. In hypothetical consent, either nobody asked you or you weren't capable of consenting at the time. But if someone had asked you, you would clearly say yes. So the traditional example here is somebody who's comatose. Now, is a person who is passed out capable of consenting to medical help? No, because you can't consent while you're incapacitated, right? But can we all agree that if you were incapacitated, you would want medical help? Yes. So that is a situation where you hypothetically consented to receiving the medical help. Now, when you wake up a few days later in the hospital bed, the doctors might ask you to sign a form giving them permission to have treated you in the past. That would be retroactive consent. I'm signing today, March 8th, happy International Women's Day, by the way, for treatment that I received on March 6th, right? That's retroactive. And then finally, we have, no, that is all 5 of them. Okay. Can you have more than one type of consent in a given situation? Possibly. I mean, enthusiastic consent rolls active consent in with it, right? So anytime that you have enthusiastic consent, you're also going to have active consent. But you could imagine a situation in which both occur.
It seems like hypothetical and retroactive are kind of the same.
No, because in retroactive, I say to you today that what happened in the past is okay. So, like, I've been gone for the weekend, and I walk in the door, and you say, hey, Azura, I borrowed your black dress while you were gone, and I had it dry cleaned. Here it is. Hope that's okay. That's retroactive consent, right? I'm consenting now to something that happened in the past, you borrowing my dress. Hypothetical consent is, you didn't ask me, but if you had, anybody would say yes. So part of the hypothetical consent is that the thing that you're consenting to is something that any reasonable person would give consent to, but you just aren't capable of consenting in the moment, or it's not possible for the person to ask, or you weren't asked. So getting back to Hobbes, right? He paints this really evil picture of the state of nature. And then he says, okay, this is really awful. Does anybody want to live in a permanent state of war? Raise your hand if you want to live in a permanent state of war. None of you. Okay, great. We all hypothetically consented to government. But he's not saying that I consent today to having been born under government a number of years ago. See how that's different? Okay. May we move on to Hobbes? All right. What is the right of nature? The right of nature is your right to use as much force as you see fit in order to remain alive. The law of nature says, oh, by the way, you have to remain alive. So the law of nature doesn't say just that I may, it says that I must. In terms of the first and the second laws of nature, yeah, it would be nice if you knew them. I'm not going to go any further past that on the midterm. Under what terms would Hobbes find it acceptable to overthrow or disobey the sovereign? As long as I can get away with it. So if the sovereign has a 49% tax rate, and I'm fine with it, but I just don't like the sovereign, or I think I could do a better job, or just I want to be sovereign, I can always try. The kicker is I'm interested in what is in my psychological best interest, right? Psychological egoist, what I believe to be in my own best interest. Am I going to be able to overthrow the sovereign? Probably not, right? So most of us are not going to try it unless the situation is pretty dire. But strictly speaking, Hobbes doesn't give us a list of situations under which you must revolt. He just says that if you're successful in revolting, it was good. If you're unsuccessful, then it was bad. Okay? Like, for example, if you come and take social and political from me, that's very different from John Locke. Locke is going to say that there are certain situations under which you must revolt, and under certain situations under which it's not permissible to revolt. Hobbes doesn't look at it that way. I have the power. I don't like you as sovereign. I overthrow you. I pull it off. Great, I'm sovereign now. I don't pull it off. I'm dead. So it doesn't really have anything to do with how he defines liberty. But I do think that it's important for us to understand this difference between negative liberty and positive liberty, or negative rights and positive rights. So when we talk about negative liberty, we're talking about the ability to do something without impediment. Versus when we're talking about positive rights or positive liberty, you're giving me something. So take the right to bear arms. We understand that as a negative right. That is to say, the government is not going to stop me from having guns. If we understood it as a positive right, that would mean that there would be some government agent handing out AR-15s to everybody, saying, okay, you're a U.S. citizen, here's your gun. That's not how we do it. So a student last class was pointing out that if you look at the debate between Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders, that one way to understand their discussion on health care is that Sanders is asking for a positive right to life, right? That we have access to health care. Versus Cruz is saying, no, you just need to not be stopped from going to the doctor, which is a negative understanding of liberty or rights to health care. Okay, so it's an important concept. Why did Hobbes go against the divine right of kings? Good question. Basically, historically speaking, there's a much more complicated answer to this. Who asked this question? So, here's what's going on. Hobbes is writing after the Protestant Reformation. So to a certain extent, this idea that we can know what God requires of us and that it's really clear is not as clear as it once was. And both sides of the war that is going on during Hobbes's life claim that God picked their guy. Well, okay, I'm pretty sure that God didn't pick two guys to be king at the same time unless he's expecting them, to co-rule or something. So Hobbes wants to move away from any sort of religious understanding of this and move towards a philosophical understanding, where he ends up pissing off the monarchists, is that they really like the idea, like, my guy was picked by God, right? He's going to be a really excellent job of ruling because God picked him. Versus, my guy is the best thug. You can see how the divine right of kings guys would be like, Hobbes, what are you doing? So, what are Hobbes's main thoughts regarding the state of nature? First of all, remember, this is not a real place, and it did not exist in historical time. This is a thought experiment. Hobbes is giving us an understanding of what the world would have been like in this situation. And really, he paints the bleakest picture possible so that we all consent to government, which he sees as being a stronger argument than God wants us to consent to this guy, or God has picked this guy. If we can say, well, we agreed to it, that seems more peachy keen. How would Hobbes view government rule over us now that there's democracy? Hobbes wouldn't like what we've done, because he would say, look, the Senate and the House, every single one of those people is passing laws in their own best interest. And there's so many of them that you can't threaten to kill them if they go too far. And that's how he pisses off all the parliamentarians, right? Because the parliamentarians are saying, instead of having a king, we should have a parliament. That way parliament will pass laws in our best interest. And Hobbes is like, no, they're going to pass laws in their own best interest. And since now there's so many of them, how can you possibly threaten them all at once? You're going to end up with a government whose laws are not at all in your best interest. You're going to end up with an oligarchy, and you're just going to believe that you have a democracy. What does Hobbes mean by we are psychological? You left out a word. We're psychological egoists. We do what we believe to be in our best interest. Is what I think is in my best interest always actually in my best interest? No. I can be wrong about what's in my best interest. Hence the psychological part of it. How do the Hobbesian theories work in real life? Can you clarify that a little bit?
So, actually, you kind of answered it. Now I think I got it.
I mean, it's basically might makes right,
Yeah.
if you had to say it in one sentence. Hobbes is saying when you have the power to do something, you become the sovereign and you pass laws that are in your best interest, but we all go along with it because it's better than the alternative, which is just crazy chaos all the time. And if we're constantly in a state of war, then, nobody can cooperate, and that's not good. thank you very much. I hope you have a fantastic spring break. Practice good consent practices while you're out there.